Pushkin. I want to let you know that Rick has a new podcast called Tetragrammaton. After about 4 to 5 years of recording Broken Record, Rick decided he wanted to talk to more than just musicians. So on his new podcast, he'll be talking to actors, directors, wrestlers, business people, anyone that Rick finds interesting. So make sure to subscribe to Tetragrammaton wherever you listen to podcasts. Roger McGuinn is best known as the driving force behind the Byrds, a group that fused folk and popular music in the 60s. But McGuinn is also a preservationist of traditional folk music. For the past 27 years, he's been re-recording traditional folk songs and sharing them on a section of his website called The Folk Den. On today's episode, Rick Rubin talks to McGuinn about The Folk Den and about his decades-long career, which started in the early 60s in Greenwich Village cafes, where he played alongside the likes of Bob Dylan and Richie Havens. McGuinn reminisces, too, about the vibrant music scene in L.A. and talks about meeting his Byrd's bandmate David Crosby for the first time. R.I.P. Cros. You'll hear McGuinn play his guitar throughout the interview and also talk about how playing basketball with Bob Dylan helped inspire Dylan's storied tour, the Rolling Thunder Revue. This is Broken Record, liner notes for the digital age. I'm Justin Richmond. Just a quick note here. You can listen to all of the music mentioned in this episode on our playlist, which you can find a link to in the show notes. For licensing reasons, each time a song is referenced in this episode, you'll hear this sound effect. All right, enjoy the episode. Here's Rick Rubin and Roger McGuinn.
Hello, hello.
Hey, Rick. How you doing?
Cool, man. Tell me about the Folk Den.
Back in 1995, I was listening to a Smithsonian Folkways album of traditional music, and it struck me that the new folk singers were not doing traditional songs anymore. They're Joni Mitchell, Bob Dylan. They're writing their own songs, and they're great songs, but what happens if, Pete Seeger dies or Odetta dies, and they did. I looked at NPR's top 100 folk songs, and only 8 of them were traditional. The rest of them were, James Taylor, Joni Mitchell, Eric Anderson, John Denver. Everybody but the hundreds of years old, like the child ballads, the cowboy songs, the sea shanties, the prison songs. All these songs were just neglected. They're just not being done. I thought, man, what's going to happen? So I knew how to record stuff on a computer. I learned that back in the early 90s when Terry Melcher invited me out to play on a Beach Boys album, and it was the first Pro Tools session with, it was a Mac Quadra with 12 gigabytes of optical RAM, and we did a Beach Boys album. It turned out to be the worst Beach Boys album in the world because he was using MIDI for the bass and drums and stuff. But it was an eye-opener for me that you could record on a computer. Before that, everybody was like, 4-track, 8-track, 16-track, 32-track, 64-track, and digital 64-track. And then Pro Tools came out. This was like a beta copy of Pro Tools back in 91. And I thought, this is great, man. I got to get this going. So I came home and I got myself some recording software. And I started recording songs and putting them up on my website in a section called The Folk Den to preserve the songs. And I put a little story about the song, the lyrics, the chords, and a little picture, like a coffee table book to kind of tie it all together. And I've been doing that since November of 1995. And to date, it's the 27th anniversary of that.
Unbelievable. It's so beautiful. I came to find Folk Den probably when the CD Treasures of the Folk Den came out is when I got turned on to it. Uh-huh. And I got turned on to it because I was researching folk songs and it was so hard to find them.
Yeah, exactly. They were going away. They were being just swept under the rug.
Was it clear in the early days, like when you first learned folk songs when you were a kid, was it obvious that this was old music from another time? Tell me about your relationship to folk music when you first got into folk music.
Well, I first got into it. I was going to high school in Chicago, and my music teacher invited Bob Gibson to come over and play a 45-minute set on the 5-string banjo. And he did all this fancy picking and telling stories about the songs. And I just loved it. Before that, I'd been to Elvis and Gene Vincent, Carl Perkins, Rockabilly, Johnny Cash, the Everly Brothers. But when Gibson did that, it made me, I run up to my music teacher and ask her, what kind of music is that? And she said, it's folk music. And I said, wow. I heard Burl Ives. He didn't sound like that. So she pointed me over to a new school that had just opened up in 1957 in Chicago called the Old Town School of Folk Music. I went over there, and Frank Hamilton sat me down and said, play me something you know. And I played a rockabilly song, and he went, uh-huh. And then he said, you know how to play the circle of fifths? And he went like... I said, no, I didn't know how to do that. He said, well, you know how to play the blues? I said, no, I didn't know how to do that either. He said, well, what about finger picking? I said, okay, I got a lot to learn. So I started going to the Old Town School 2 days a week, and I did that for 3 years until Frank Hamilton finally said, I really can't teach you anything more in this format. You could have some private lessons for $12 an hour. Well, I didn't have the $12 an hour. So that was it. I kind of quit going to the Old Town School. But shortly after that, I went down to the Gate of Horn after a coffee house gig, and I had my banjo and guitar and hard shell cases, and I was real proud of them because I looked like a professional musician. And I walked in, Limelighters and Theodore Bikel were sitting around the bar. So I walked into the bar, and this jam session was going on, and Alex Haselev from the Limelighters said, what do you got there, kid? I said, I got a banjo and a guitar. And he said, great, break out the banjo. We got too many guitars going. So I did. And I played with them till 5 o'clock in the morning. Wow. And that's when they hired me. They hired me to be a backup musician for them. Amazing. But I said, well, I can't start right now because I'm still going to high school. And so they sent me a letter, and my parents had to sign it because I was under 18. And they sent me a plane ticket in June and flew me out to LA. And I recorded with them at the Ash Grove, a record called Tonight in Person. And that was the beginning of my professional musical career.
How old were you at that time?
I was 17 when I went out there. I turned 18 at the Ash Grove.
Amazing. But you started as a rock fan and then you fell in love with folk. Is that how it happened?
Yeah, I got into Elvis when I was 14. I had a transistor radio, which was a new thing at the time. And it meant you could listen to what you wanted to listen to on the radio instead of a big wooden box in the living room. And I used to ride my bike around Chicago and listen to WJJD, which was a rock station. And I heard I went, wow, that's really cool. And I had no idea that he was combining country music and blues. And, he was doing a synthesis of different styles because he'd grown up with that all around him.
Do you think that's what makes all great new forms of music are synthesis of other forms of music that come together to create something new?
I do. I really do, yeah. And that's what happened when we combined the Beatles and Bob Dylan, and people went, wow, that's different. I mean, they say, okay, well, Eric Byrd had done House of New Orleans, which was a blues, a folk song, and he did that before Mr. Tambourine Man, but somehow Mr. Tambourine Man was a little different. It was a more of a legato kind of thing, with a flowing melody, and the lyrics were out of this world. I mean, take me for a trip on your magic swirling ship. All my senses have been stripped. My hands can't feel the grip. My toes too numb to step. Wait only for my boot heels to be wandering. I went, wow, this is so cool. And I fell in love with Dylan's writing at that point.
Was that the first Bob Dylan song you ever heard?
No, I was in the Village hanging out in the early 60s when Bob got there. I was hanging out at Gertie's Folk City, and I saw Bob play there. And he was mostly doing Woody Guthrie stuff at that point. He hadn't... one time, though, I was over at the White Horse Tavern, and Theodore Bikel came running over. He'd been in, I guess, the Gaslight Cafe, and he said, I just heard this marvelous song. It was blowing in the wind, and he played it, So, yeah, I'd heard Dylan's stuff before the Byrds.
Was it obvious when you decided to do a cover song in the Byrds of a Dylan song, was it obvious that Tambourine Man would be the first one? How did it happen that you picked that song if you knew the others?
We didn't really pick it. Jim Dixon was our manager, and he was a producer, engineer at World Pacific Records in LA. And he had an advanced copy of Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man, which was something like and he thought it was a great song, I guess, lyrically and the tune. And he was kind of shopping it around to different people. I think some of the guys who were bluegrass guys back in LA heard it first. And he played it for us. It was a 4.5 minute demo with Bob and Ramblin' Jack Elliott. And Ramblin' was just kind of out there and singing out of tune. So that's why he didn't release it, because Bob never liked to go back and fix stuff. You know, it's like like to get the impromptu thing, whatever happened when you recorded it. So we had this demo, and they played it for us, and Crosby said, "I don't like it, man. That folky 2/4 time, it's never going to play on the radio." And he was right, because radio wouldn't play anything over like 2.5 minutes, and they're playing rock and roll 4/4 beat instead of 2/4. So I rearranged it. I'd been an arranger. I worked with, I was a studio guy in New York, and I worked with Judy Collins and some other people. So I rearranged it with the, and it changed the whole thing.
1,000,000%. I mean, it's the signature musical sound of the song, and it created a whole new genre. It's amazing. You talked about so many interesting things, and I want to hear about all of them. So let's talk about the Village folk scene when you were there. What was that world like first? How long were you there for? Who were the other artists around? Tell me everything about it.
Okay, well, after the Limelighters gig, I got a sideman gig with the Chad Mitchell Trio, and I actually moved to New York and lived on, I had an apartment with Mike Settle on 14th Street. This is early 60s, I guess 60, 61, 62, 63, around there. And the Village was very vibrant with folk music at the Gaslight Cafe. Dave Van Ronk was there, and other artists, and Bob would, be around. He played Gertie's Folk City. And I used to watch all the acts at Cisco Houston and all the guys that played Folk City, and I'd go to like the other coffee houses, the Cafe One. But I got a gig at the Cafe Playhouse. It was on McDougal Street, and it was one of the you pass a hat around kind of place, yeah. And I remember Richie Havens was there at the time, John Sebastian, and Peter Tork was playing banjo at that point. And I remember Sebastian saying, you don't want to follow Richie Havens, because if you pass a hat after Richie, there's no money left. It's all gone. So there was a vibrant folk scene. I remember Freddie Neal there hanging out, and all kinds of folk singers around.
And the majority of them were playing traditional folk songs.
Yes, they were. They're playing acoustic traditional songs. And then the Beatles came out while I was still living in New York. And I heard the Beatles, and I went, wow. They were using folk music chord changes. I thought, wow, the million folk songs had that. And it gave me the idea of combining folk music and rock and roll. And I started doing some Beatles songs at the Cafe Playhouse, and people were going, what's he doing, man? It's like, But one clue, I think I was on Bleecker Street, and there were a couple of promoters that I'd seen around, and they pointed to me and said, what we need is 4 of him. I went, oh, I think I'm onto something.
Amazing. And then when did you decide to put the band together? Or did you decide, or did it just happen?
It happened. So I was playing these Beatle-y kind of songs at the Cafe Playhouse, and people weren't going for it. But the promoter liked it. He put a sign outside that said Beatle impersonation. And the tourist buses were coming around, and I thought, this is embarrassing. I want to get out of New York. So I flew out to LA, and I got a gig at the Troubadour, opening up for Hoyt Axton. And I was doing the same kind of material, and nobody liked it there either, except for Gene Clark. Gene Clark came backstage and said, hey, I get what you're doing. I like the Beatles. I like folk music. Let's write some songs and see what happens. So we started writing songs every day in the front room of the Troubadour, which was open all day, and you could go there for free. And then Crosby came in. Now, I had met David Crosby years earlier when I was with the Limelighters, and we played the Ash Grove. The night before the Limelighters engagement at the Ash Grove, there was a play going on called Endgame by Samuel Beckett. It was a one-act play with 4 characters, and 2 of them were in garbage cans. and they pop up and say their lines and pop back down again. And this is years before Sesame Street got the idea. So I stuck around to the end of the play, and I met the guy who'd been in the garbage can, and it was a young actor named David Crosby. So I met him. I think he was 18. I was 17 by then. Maybe I was 18 already. But he was about a year older than me. And after the gig with the Limelighters, I wanted to go up to San Francisco. So David took me up to Santa Barbara, which was his boyhood home. And I stayed there overnight, and his mother made us lamb and avocado sandwiches, and they were delicious. And then I went up to San Francisco, and that's where I got a call from the Chad Mitchell Trio to fly to New York and work with them. So that's when I was in the Village. I was living in New York around that time. This is 1960, maybe the end of 1960, 61, 62. And then I traveled extensively with the Chad Mitchell Trio. Didn't really have a home base. I had this apartment with Mike Settle, but I didn't really spend any time there.
Was John Denver yet in the Chad Mitchell Trio when you were part of it, or he was after?
No, John Denver was a replacement for Chad Mitchell, who
I see.
Either left the trio to become a solo artist, or I know he got busted for a large amount of marijuana over the Mexican border. And I think he did some time for it. So the Mitchell Trio became the Mitchell Trio without Chad. And that's when they got John Denver to fill in for Chad.
How did you connect with Bobby Darin?
He was in the audience at the Crescendo Club when we were opening up. The Chad Mitchell Trio was opening up for Lenny Bruce. And Bobby came backstage after the Chad Mitchell set and said, "Hey, I liked what you were doing up there. I'm thinking about putting a folk segment in my act, and I'd like to hire you." And I said, "Well, I've already got a job with the Chad Mitchell Trio." And he said, "Yeah, what are they paying you?" And I told him, and he said, "I'll double it." I said, "Okay." I was getting ready to move on. I'd been hanging out with some people from the New Christie Minstrels, and I thought about jumping ship with them. And Bobby said, "No, man, if you do that, you just get buried in a group that size."
Did he ever talk to you about why he wanted to go from, let's say, a Sinatra-esque singer to doing folk music?
Well, I think he just appreciated it. I think he liked it. He was quite good at it. We didn't do just like Kingston Trio stuff. We did real prison songs, Makes a Long-Time Man Feel Bad.
That's a great song.
Yeah. And so he'd come out and do Splish Splash and his rock and roll hits for about 15 minutes. He'd bring me on, and I'd stand next to him and sing a harmony and play some folk songs with a 12-string. And then I was off for the rest of the night, and he'd go out and do his Sinatra stuff, Mac the Knife and all that. And this is fun because I used to, on the Strip in Vegas, I used to go up the Strip and check out the other shows. And I remember I used to like Don Rickles. So I walked on the Don Rickles show one time, and he saw me coming in, and he said, "Hey, there's this kid here. He plays for Bobby Darin. He walks around Vegas going, 'I'm a star, I'm a star.'" I said, "Wow, Don Rickles knew who I was."
That's amazing. I'm just thinking about the world that Bobby Darin was in, and just based on what you already said, he went from Splish Splash, which is how we knew of him, to the more Frank Sinatra style, which it was already a style shift. So I guess for him doing folk music, he was already chameleon stylistically.
He was a very talented guy. He could do a lot of stuff. He could tap dance, and he could play the vibes and piano and guitar and do impressions. And it was kind of the old school of talent where, suit pressed, shoes shined, in tune, on time. It was like a discipline that rock and roll just threw out the window when I got into rock and roll bands. But working for Bobby was a good experience. And I used to follow Bobby around and ask him stuff about how to make it in the business. And he said, "Well, you got to get up in front of audiences as much as you can, because it doesn't matter how good you are in your room. You got to test it under fire." And that was good advice. And then I mentioned that I wanted to do a movie. He said, "Well, I'm having a hard enough time getting myself in the movies, but I'll check around, see what I can do." So about a week later, he came up with this script. And he said, "This is from Jackie Cooper." I said, "Okay." So I opened it up, and it was about a banjo player. I said, "Oh, I'm a banjo player. I could do that." I turned another page, and it was about a banjo player in Petticoat Junction. I said, "Oh, man, I don't think I could do this, man." He said, "Well, you don't want to turn down Jackie Cooper because you'll never work in Hollywood." And you know what? I never have.
It all worked out.
It worked out great.
We're going to take a quick break and then come back with more from Rick Rubin and Roger McGuinn. We're back with more from Rick Rubin and Roger McGuinn.
So it's interesting that you're in the Village, either playing folk songs or Beatles songs. Everyone there are playing cover songs. What was the impetus to start writing songs? If you're coming out of a scene that's based on historic music, when did it become obvious we have to write our own songs?
Yeah, the singer-songwriter thing. Well, before that, I had a job with Bobby Darin, and I worked at the Brill Building as a songwriter. So, that was the impetus for me to write songs. And I think what happened was the folk thing kind of just started to fade out. It was like the end of it by 64, it was starting to fade out. And people started writing more. So I don't know what made Joni Mitchell write Clouds, or I have no idea. Dylan was very inventive, and at first he was doing kind of Woody Guthrie imitation, and then he developed his own style. I remember I was friends with John and Michelle Phillips, and I showed them some stuff I was doing, the Beatles influence, and they said, "Oh, that's just bubblegum, that's kid stuff." And I said, "Well, it's got something to it."
Cool. Tell me about Jim Dixon. How did you come in contact with him, and what was he like?
Okay, I first met Jim back in 1963, and he was hanging around the Troubadour and the Ash Grove and all that. He was going around kind of scouting talent because he was a producer. And he knew David Crosby. He had already recorded David, and he was looking around for different ideas. And I remember when Gene Clark and I started writing songs at the Troubadour, David Crosby came in and started singing harmony with us. And he said, "I want to be in your band." And I said, "Well, we don't really have a band here, David. We're just kind of writing some songs." He said, "Oh, come on, man. If I can be in your band, I know this guy's got a recording studio we could use for free." I said, "You're in." That's how we met Jim Dixon.
Cool.
And he took us under his wing. He was still working at World Pacific. He'd recorded Lord Buckley there, and he knew some jazz guys. And he let us work out on the machines after all the sessions were over. And that's where we kind of honed our skill as a singing, playing band in, I guess, 64 by then. So we started working out at the studio, and became apparent that we needed more musicians and more instruments. So we went to see the Beatles movie, A Hard Day's Night, and took notes on Ringo had Ludwig drums, and Harrison had a Gretsch guitar. John Lennon had a Rickenbacker, and Paul McCartney had a Hofner bass, a violin-style bass. And then George Harrison came back out with another Rickenbacker. It looked like a six-string from the front, but when he turned it sideways, you could see 6 other tuning pegs sticking out the back. And I went, "Oh man, that's an electric 12-string. I got to get one of those," because I was already a 12-string player on acoustic 12. And we traded in. So I traded in a 5-string banjo and a Gibson acoustic 12 that Bobby Darin had given me, and got the Rickenbacker, and that became my main instrument for the rest of the Byrds.
Was the electric 12-string a new instrument at the time?
Yes, it was. It was a brand new invention. George had the very second one ever made. First one went to a woman called Susie, who played in Las Vegas in some sort of girl band. And George had the second one. Well, when Rickenbacker learned the Beatles were playing one of their instruments, F.C. Hall, John Hall's father, flew to New York, had a meeting with the Beatles, and gave George Harrison. Well, it was actually intended for John Lennon, but John was out and George had the flu and he was hanging around the hotel. So they gave him the 12-string, and it became his kind of toy. He played it really well. And he did this cool thing that I learned from him. He did this thing on, see, the octave strings. He used to play leads up and down the G string pair, like, had a lot of punch, much more than if you just went the, So I learned that trick from him.
Did you incorporate that into any songwriting?
Yeah. Well, it was in quite a few songs. The way I played lead on, say, Turn, 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 and so on. I got other riffs from other musicians like the Seekers and the Searchers, I stole whatever I could. But the Rickenbacker had this really great sound. And then Ray Gerhard was the studio engineer at Columbia Records in L.A. And he put, I think it was 2, now I'm not sure the designation, L.A. UAs It was a tube compressor, and he put the Rickenbacker into one and then out of the back of the one into another. So he had double compression on it, and it clamped it down and made it sustain more like a wind instrument, because the original sound of the Rickenbacker would fall off rather quickly. It was kind of a thuddy sounding instrument. So that's really what made the 12-string sound so distinctive on Mr. Tambourine Man and Turn, Turn, Turn at 8 Miles High.
So do you think without the compression, was it more like a harpsichord, would you say?
No, it sounded okay, but it didn't sustain as well. It wasn't as good for lead work. It was okay for chording, for strumming and so on, but it wasn't really a good lead instrument at that point.
How did you find the other members to make the Byrds the Byrds?
Gene Clark and I started writing songs.
Yep.
David Crosby came along and turned us on to Jim Dixon, and we got a free studio to work out in. And Dixon recommended we get a drummer and a bass player. And we saw Michael Clark walk in front of the Troubadour. It looked like two of the Rolling Stones. And we got him mostly on looks.
Yeah. This is like 1965, 1966?
64.
64. Wow. Incredible.
At 64 into 65, we recorded Mr. Tambourine Man in January of 65, and Columbia didn't release it until, I think, June or May or sometime. They sat on it for a long time. I like to tell a story about Columbia was very conservative. They had Steve Lawrence and Eddie Gourmet. They had Doris Day. They didn't have any rock and roll, and their attitude toward rock and roll was that they thought it might be distasteful, like the mob not wanting to sell heroin, but there was a lot of money in it.
Was Mr. Tambourine Man the first rock record that came out on Columbia?
I think it might have been.
It
certainly
64.
wasn't something they weren't really into it yet. They were kind of lagging behind the other labels, RCA and Capitol.
But in some ways, wasn't the world lagging behind? Like, was it yet the popular form of music, or was it still sort of underground or?
Well, no. Rock and roll was a craze, and people kept hoping it would go away quickly because it was creating juvenile delinquents.
That was the story.
Yeah, there's a story. And so, but RCA had Elvis back in, 56. So it had been around a while. And then we had Chuck Berry, and we had Gene Vincent, Carl Perkins, and Everly Brothers and Johnny Cash. There's quite a bit of rock and roll out there.
All of those artists, though, have more of a country flavor in their rock. It's all coming from the South, and it's more like an extension of the Sun Records sound.
Yeah, it was rockabilly.
Yeah, more rockabilly than rock and roll. And it seemed like, I guess Little Richard might have been more rock and roll, and Chuck Berry was rock and roll.
Well, Bill Haley and the Comets are credited with starting the craze, and they were kind of like a Holiday Inn band, They weren't really rocking or rolling. Gene Vincent really rocked, and so did Elvis and Carl Perkins.
The places you'd be playing in those, like Ciro's in those days, would hold 50 people, 100, 200 people? How many people would you say?
I'm not sure of the capacity of Ciro's. It might have been 100, might have been 150. It was all these sort of plush booths with tables. It was almost like a casino.
Yeah, I was going to say like Las Vegas.
Yeah, like Vegas, yeah. It was something like that. It was old hat. It had been popular in the 40s with all the movie stars, and then it lost its appeal. But when the Byrds got there, we started attracting Jack Nicholson and Peter Fonda and Marlon Brando. And then we had this group of dancers, Vito and his gang, and they were wild. They were just, and they were just a scene by themselves. And so the whole thing really, it changed Hollywood a little bit.
How did you meet Vito? Vito Pellicas, yes?
Yeah.
How did you meet him?
I don't remember. I remember going to his studio and taking acid. That's all I remember. I don't know how we got hooked up with them, but they became our dancing troupe, and they even went with us on the road on our first tour.
Amazing.
Took them on a bus tour to Indiana and Michigan and places where people were freaking out. They'd never seen anything.
Minds.
Never seen anything like it. No.
Did they dance on the stage or in the audience?
In the audience.
Cool.
In front of the stage.
Amazing. But did they face the band or did they face the audience? Like, did it feel like they were part of the show?
They were totally, no, they weren't facing anybody. They were totally absorbed in what they were doing. They
I
were
see.
Just, they're just doing it.
So it was like a traveling dance party that happened between you and the audience.
Yeah. That's right.
Wow. It's some wild to imagine,
Yeah, it was wild. The audience were like teenagers. They were pretty square, they were like preppy looking, most of them. And they're maybe 13, 14, 15-year-olds, and they're just looking on in amazement at this whole spectacle. We did get screams. We got screaming fans at one point.
How long did it take for the audience to go from square fans to starting looking more like people who could have been in bands?
Yeah. Well, I remember I used to wear those little glasses. Mm-hmm. I remember looking out in the audience and there'd be people with those little glasses on. So it was starting to catch on, maybe not more than a few months.
How's your relationship to music changed from the early days to now?
Well, it's a labor of love. I do shows. I still do shows, and I do like a one-man show. It's like a play that has a lot of these stories I'm telling you. And I fold in the songs that go with the stories, and I change it up. It's not always the same. We got all these modules. You can put in different modules of stories and songs, and my wife and I just hit the road together. It's an idea I got from Ramblin' Jack Elliott when I was on the Rolling Thunder Revue, mm-hmm. and Ramblin' said, yeah, one of the most fun things I ever did was throw the guitar in the back of the Land Rover, and me and Polly, that was his wife, hit the road, and we did all these little gigs, and it was so much fun. And I'd been in a band with, had instrument cases and trucks and a lot of logistics and people to deal with. And I thought, man, this would be more fun. So I started doing that, and then gradually it became kind of a scripted one-man play.
It sounds great. Tell me about Rolling Thunder. What was that experience like?
Rolling Thunder was great. It started off with Bob used to come over to my house in Malibu, and he noticed a basketball hoop over the garage. And he said, "You have a basketball?" I said, "No." Because when I was 15, I jammed my finger on a basketball, and I couldn't play guitar for a few weeks. But I bought a basketball the next day, and I called up his house, and he was out, but I got Sarah, and I said, "Well, tell Bob I got a basketball." She said, "Oh, he'll be thrilled." So Bob came over the next day, and we're shooting baskets in the backyard. He said, "I want to do something different." And I said, "Wow, what do you mean?" He said, "I don't know, something like a circus." Okay, so a couple of weeks later, I was on the road with a band, and I had some time off, and I went to the Village, and went to Gertie's Folk City, and I ran into Larry Sloman, who at the time was a reporter for Rolling Stone magazine. And Larry said, "I think Dylan's over at the other end, or the bitter end, what it was called." So I said, "Let's go see." So we went over there and walked in the back room, and there was Jacques Levy, my writing partner, and Bob Dylan sitting at a table with a couple of brandies. And I walked in, and they set up, and the brandies went flying. They said, "Roger, we were just talking about you. We're putting this tour together. We'd like you to go on it." So I had a band, and I was on tour myself, but I postponed those dates and went on Rolling Thunder. And it was all Bob's friends from the Village. It's Bobby Newirth and Ramblin' Jack Elliott and Allen Ginsberg, and Joan Baez came along, Joni Mitchell. And we'd pick up people like Willie Nelson in Texas and Gordon Lightfoot in Toronto and Leonard Cohen in Montreal. It was an amazing, amazing tour. About 100 people on the road in buses and cars, and it was like a parade, and it wasn't like a circus. It was like a circus, and it wasn't exactly like the Scorsese film portrays it. I think it was even more fun than that.
I bet. It sounds incredible, and the recordings from that era are some of my favorite of his. Like his voice sounds great, his singing is great, the song sounds so good.
He was really on his game at that point, and some of my favorite songs are the ones he wrote with Jacques Levy for Desire.
Agreed. Tell me about Subud.
Okay, well, when I was in the Village, I was hanging out with Bob Carey, who had been in a group called the Terriers, with Eric Darling and Alan Arkin, and there was this mime, Lionel Shepard. And we're walking around, and Bob and I are sharing a joint. And I offered it to Lionel, and he said, "No, I got something better." I said, "What's that?" He said, "It's called Subud." I said, "What is it? Something you put in your coffee and drink it?" Or he said, come on down, next Thursday and see what it is. So I did. And it was a spiritual exercise. It was kind of like the Holy Spirit, but it wasn't Christian or anything. It was just, So I got into it. It was something I did for a while.
I had a friend who was in Subud, grew up in Subud, and she followed Ramadan.
Yeah, a lot of people were into Islam. Well, it came out of Indonesia. So the head guy, Bapak, they called him, he was a Muslim. So it was a kind of nonverbal Islam. There was no doctrine or anything. It was just, you go in and do these, it's almost like a dance. You do a spiritual dance, and it's supposed to be good for your soul.
Yeah, it's great. I didn't realize that there was a physical component. Would you say that this was like TM, like a spiritual fad of the time?
I think so. I got out of it. I didn't stay in it, and later I accepted Jesus. So, that's all I needed.
And how did that happen?
It happened in '77 when Elvis Presley died, and he was 7 years older than I was. I was 35, and he was doing quaaludes and uppers and downers, and I had a doctor in LA who'd give me anything I wanted, and I was doing that too. Plus, the illegal drugs that I got my hands on. So I thought, man, Elvis just died, and he was 7 years older. If I only got 7 years, I better start cleaning up my act. And so I started working on that. And in the process, that's when I ran into this jazz guy named Billy, and he prayed with me about Jesus, and I accepted Jesus.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
So it changed your lifestyle to a healthy lifestyle, and you have this spiritual connection.
Right.
It's beautiful.
Right.
Inspiring.
And my wife and I turned my wife onto it. I met her in an acting class. We were both starting the same night, and we had to do method acting. And the assignment was to get her to do something she didn't want to do. And I had talked to her before and found out she'd been a Baptist when she was a kid, but got away from it. So I knew something she didn't want to do. So I started singing and I said, what do you think of that? She said, it sounds kind of country. I said, yeah, what do you think of the words? She said, oh, man, you're trying to tell me about Jesus? And she stomped off the stage, and all the kids in the class clapped, and it said, wow, what was that? That sounded like, a real play. And then a couple of weeks later, she accepted Jesus, and now we've been together for 44 years, and we read the Bible every morning.
Beautiful. Congratulations. Can you play that song for us now?
Let's see.
That's beautiful. I never heard that song before.
Really?
No.
It's a Louvin Brothers song. It's a written song in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. Not a gospel song, but it's the Louvin Brothers did it.
It's beautiful. Hearing that makes me want to hear a whole album of you doing acoustic devotional material. Just sharing that.
Could do that.
That's what I want to hear.
You wanted to hear something else? The Cane Blues. You said.
Oh yeah. Yes. So this is my favorite. My favorite of the folk den songs that I'm aware of is this one.
That's interesting. The story goes, it's an old prison song. And I recorded it back when there was a website called mp3.com. Michael Robertson is an entrepreneur. He put together this website, and he would take MP3s and make little CDs of them, and he'd give you 50%, which is unheard of in the record business. So I signed up for that, and I did Cane Blues. First, it was called Ain't No More Cane on the Brazos, and nobody was clicking on it. I changed the title to Cane Blues, and it shot up the charts.
I love that song.
It's a cool song. I heard it from Bob Gibson the first time, and he did it a little different. I think I changed the chords on it, but I like the chord pattern. It's unusual in that it's got a lot of passing chords, instead of so it's got some interesting passing chords.
There's so much emotion in it, and I've played that song for many artists that I work with, just to talk about the amount of emotion that can be held in a song, even when you don't necessarily know what all the words are about. And what's also interesting about it is it's so repetitive. It's a very simple structure that just keeps repeating.
It's a loop, yeah. There's no chorus or anything.
But it doesn't get old. It doesn't get old. That loop can go on for a long time, and it does feel like the emotion in it just keeps getting deeper and deeper with the story. It's It's beautiful, beautiful song.
Okay, well, Old Hannah is the sun, the sunrise.
I didn't know that.
Old Hannah is the sun rising.
What are the other? Decode as much as you can for me. It'd be great for me.
Okay, well, ain't no more cane on the brazos. It was a sugar cane, like a work farm for a prison, and they cut all the cane down and turned it into molasses.
Brazos is the river?
Brazos River, yeah, down in Texas. What's the matter? Something must be wrong. We're still rolling. That's being still in prison. Shorty George done gone. He got out. Shorty George got out somehow. There's something wrong. We're still here, and he's gone.
I see.
Yeah. Look at my old Hannah. She's a turning red.
So
that's
sunset
the sunrise
or sunrise.
Or it could be sunset. Yeah. Look at my partner. He's almost dead. They just worked the people to death there. Go down, old Hannah. Don't you rise no more. Okay, that's the sunset.
Yeah.
And if you rise anymore, you bring judgment. Sure, we're gonna get in trouble tomorrow. Because we get in trouble every day.
Yeah.
Every day is trouble. Should have been here around 1904. It's a dead man on every turn row. So people are, getting worked to death. There was one, should have been here in 1910, working women just like the men. So it's a prison song about harsh, labor-intensive, work you to death kind of stuff.
Wow. I had no idea it even was prison-related. Again, without knowing the context, there's nothing in the lyric if you don't know what it means. It was clearly a sad song, and it was clearly a work song, but I didn't understand that it was a prison song.
Yeah, and that's the kind of thing that gets lost with the singer-songwriter genre. People aren't doing those old songs anymore.
Yeah, I'm so thankful that you're doing the Folk Den and that these songs live on. And if people want to hear them, they go to the website. Is that the best way?
McGuinn.com, the Folk Den section.
Great.
We have to pause for another quick break, but we'll be back with the rest of Rick's conversation with Roger McGuinn in just a sec. We're back with Rick Rubin and Roger McGuinn.
How has recording changed over the course of your life? So it started, you said it was tape in the beginning, but really more specifically, technologically, from the early days of recording until now, what are all the changes that you've seen?
The first recording I did was on a Ampex 3-track, and we recorded Beach Ball on that. Bobby Darin played drums, and Frank Gehry played piano, and I played guitar, and we all sang and clapped our hands, and we got a record deal on Capitol, called ourselves the City Surfers. And that was a 3-track. We couldn't really overdub very well. And then when I got in the Byrds, they had a 4-track at Columbia Studios in LA. And they had an 8-track. It was over against the wall. And somebody had written with a Sharpie or, like felt pen, "Big Bastard" on this 8-track. And they didn't want to hook it up because it was too new, too much trouble. They finally did. They finally got the 8-track going. But so I went from 3-track to 4-track to 8-track to 16-track to 32-track, 64-track, and digital. And then I told you about the digital audio workstations and couldn't afford Pro Tools when I first ran into it. It was like $10,000 for a rudimentary setup. So I got something called Digital Orchestrator Plus. It was like a $90 program, and it did the same thing. It recorded in 44.1 waveforms, 16-bit. And it sounded pretty good. I recorded the Treasures from the Folk Den on that system. Cool. And then gradually I got Pro Tools, and I've had Pro Tools for years and years now. And, I find it very easy to work with and fun. I love being able to pop things in and move them around like a word processor.
And I imagine the advantage of being able to record at home versus in a big studio with all this equipment is it's a good change in terms of being able to make whatever you want whenever you want.
Absolutely. I mean, I tell kids, I say, you don't need to go to a recording studio and spend thousands of dollars. You can just get a Mac and Pro Tools and do it at home. I mean, all you need is a good microphone and maybe some editing skills.
Yeah. You said you went into the earliest version, the 3-man version of the Byrds. I don't know what you were called at that time.
It was a jet set, called the Jet Set.
The Jet Set. Do you remember what you recorded in that first session when you decided we need more players?
I think it was some stuff that Gene Clark and I had written, like The Only Girl That I Adore or whatever. You Showed Me, which the Turtles later picked up, was one of the songs that Gene and I wrote, and it was rejected for the Byrds. We didn't get to do it, but the Turtles got a hit with it.
Cool. Do you remember it at all? You showed me?
Yeah.
Can you play me a little of it? Are the chord changes rooted in classical music? It feels like it is.
Well, it was subliminally rooted in classic, because Gene Clark and I wrote it. We were standing in Jim Dixon's driveway, and we both had a crush on the same girl. And we wrote it about this girl that we both had a crush on. And I remember something interesting. There's something like spiritual in it, because as I was playing it, my guitar, it was almost like a divining rod. It was moving around in figure eights, like an infinity sign. It was kind of unusual for that to happen.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, like a dowsing rod or divining rod.
Yeah,
yes.
Yeah, something like that, like a divining water.
Amazing.
I've got a BMI award for 1 million plays. It's probably had more than that by now, but it's been covered by Salt and Pepper and
wow.
Let's see, U2,
wow.
Kanye West.
Wow, it's such a beautiful song. I love that song.
Thank you.
Have you had any other mystical experiences?
Oh yeah, I mean yeah.
Tell me.
Well, I sometimes I see stuff through the walls, like little dots of light and things like that. You could call it hallucinating, whatever. But and also I've always had this tactile thing where, I could feel something in the air, something that isn't there. I used to do that. I remember in the Columbia studio, I'd be waving my hand around while I was singing, and when I sang Mr. Tambourine Man, Jim Dixon had made us read An Actor Prepares by Stanislavski. Jim had a little experience in the Hollywood area. He was married to Diane Varsi for a short time, and he helped her with her career until she decided she didn't want to live in Hollywood and do that. So he made us read An Actor Prepares, which is about method acting. So when I got the lyrics to Mr. Tambourine Man, I wanted to do a parallel meaning. And I was singing, "Hey, Mr. Tambourine Man, play a song for me. I'm not sleepy and there is no place I'm going to." I wasn't singing to an abstract tambourine man. I was singing to God.
Beautiful.
So that was a mystical experience too. I think the reason that song was as popular as it was is because it had some real heartfelt truth in it.
Absolutely. And there's something about lyrically, there's nothing obviously devotional in Tambourine Man. But when you're connected in a devotional way, there's an energy that can come through that you can just feel it. I never knew that. It's a beautiful story. I love hearing that story.
Yeah.
Do you feel things in space in general or just in certain places?
Well, it's not all the time. I wouldn't say it's dependent on the place so much as the time and the, mental, spiritual attitude I have, whatever. I remember they asked Tom Petty about how he writes songs. He said, well, they come down from, I don't want to know. He said, might go away. Tom was a great friend and a wonderful inspiration to me. I know I inspired him somewhat, but, he was just an incredible performer and songwriter and a really sweet guy. He was just the sweetest guy.
He was the best. You inspired him a lot, and he talked about you all the time. This is the first time we're meeting, but he talked about you all of the time.
Oh, well, we had a good friendship.
He was a great songwriter, but he was such a great musician and had such a beautiful voice, but he knew everything about making records. Like in the studio, he was a total craftsman. He could do anything. And it was just fun to be around him. I learned so much being around him.
Yeah. Wow. Well, we miss him.
Absolutely. Have you heard other versions of songs you've written that made you hear them in a new way?
Yeah, well, 8 Miles High got covered by Husker Du.
Yeah, Husker Du.
And they did sort of a real headbanger version of it, like loud and raucous. It was good. And So You Want to Be a Rock and Roll Star got covered a lot.
Yeah.
By Patti Smith and Tom Petty.
When you hear other people do your songs, does it feel like that's my song, or does it feel like, oh, I like what they're doing with this thing? Like, what's the experience like hearing someone else sing a song you've written?
It's a nice feeling, even if you don't appreciate the whole way they did it, it's a nice feeling to know that they did do it.
Yeah, they picked you. They picked your song. They picked your work.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they could have picked anything, and they picked yours. So tell me about Terry Melcher.
Okay, when we got signed to Columbia Records, Jim Dixon assumed that he would be our producer because he was a record producer. And Columbia had a strict policy. They were a union house, and they only used their staff producers. So they assigned us the 23-year-old son of one of their biggest artists, Doris Day. It was Terry.
Had he already produced a lot of stuff at 23?
Well, he knew what he was doing. He was friends with Brian Wilson, and he knew Brian had used the Wrecking Crew on some Beach Boys stuff, and he also knew that Michael Clarke couldn't play the drums, and we were a fledgling band just kind of learning how to play together. So he got the Wrecking Crew to come and do the band track of Mr. Tambourine Man, and the flip side, I Knew I'd Want You. And I was allowed to play on it because I'd been a studio musician in New York, and I also had the Rickenbacker and the licks, so I got to play on it. And then the band went nuts. It said, no, we want to be like the Beatles. We want to play on our own stuff. And okay, so they got to ever after that. We just only did 2 tracks with the Wrecking Crew. But with the Wrecking Crew, we knocked out 2 songs in a 3-hour session. And when we got the whole band playing, it took us 77 takes to get Turn, Turn, Turn.
What was it like playing with the Wrecking Crew?
It was really fun. That they were so polished and professional. They didn't do a strict beat. I analyzed some of their stuff, and they're like a school of fish. They'd go around together. They maybe go up tempo, down tempo, and sideways, and but they were always together. They were tight. And I was a little nervous. Hal Blaine said, "You ought to go out and have a couple of beers, kid." But I didn't. So, but we got the session done, and it came out good. So,
were they older than you guys at that time?
Yeah, they're about maybe like 7 years older, about like Elvis's age.
I see.
It was Hal Blaine, Leon Russell on electric piano, Jerry Cole on a 6-string guitar, and Jerry was playing chinks like. And that was something they got from Don't Worry Baby, because they played on Don't Worry Baby for the Beach Boys, and there were chinks in that. And then Bill Pittman played on it. Bill Pittman was guitar, Jerry Cole guitar, and Larry Knechtel, who usually did keyboards, played bass.
Wow, he's great.
Yeah, he was great. It was a fun experience. A little nerve-wracking, but fun.
For sure. But I think that some people know the story of the Wrecking Crew, but they're one of the greatest bands of all time, really.
Absolutely. And I didn't know they were the band that played on Phil Spector's Wall of Sound stuff. I used to love "Da Do Ron Ron" and "My Boyfriend's Back" or whatever, all those songs that. Oh, and then when Hal passed away, the story came out. See, I always thought this was a Beatle beat, like. Okay, so the story goes that Hal dropped a stick. He was on one of the sessions, and so he couldn't play boom boom. Boom. He could go boom, 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 boom.
That's incredible.
And as a musician, when you make a mistake, you want to continue it so it sounds like you did it on purpose. And that's what he did. So he invented that boom, boom, boom beat because he dropped a stick.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah.
That's the sound of all the Phil Spector records.
It is. That's the sound. And then the Beatles picked it up.
Yeah.
And I used to call it a Beatle beat because I didn't realize that Hal had come up with it for Phil Spector.
That's amazing. And came up with it by mistake. This is a great thing to talk about. How much do mistakes play into the process of writing something?
Well, that one sure did. Yeah. I don't know, but I love the... Oh, yeah, at the Brill Building, Kenny Young and I used to analyze Phil Spector records, and we'd look at he used to scribble little stuff on the vinyl. And it's like audio matrix he wrote with a little stylus, the Wall of Sound.
Wow. Why did Gene Clark leave the band?
Well, there's 2 stories about that. The first one goes, we were ready to fly from LA to New York to do a TV special with Murray the K. And back in those days, you could kind of get on a plane whenever you wanted. They didn't have the screening and all the stuff they got now. So I used to show up late. I'd get there just before they closed the door. And so I got on the plane, and everybody's on the plane, and Gene Clark is standing up in the aisle in a cold sweat. He's going, man, I can't do this, man. And we thought, wow, this maybe he's psychic, maybe he knows something. Anyway, he got off the plane, and I remember saying, well, if you can't fly, you can't be a bird.
That's really funny.
Yeah.
So you said there are two versions of the story. That's one.
Okay, well, that was one. He had a nervous breakdown on the plane and left.
Yeah. And you think it was he's just afraid of flying?
He was afraid of flying.
And it just got worse. By that time, the pressure.
Yeah, well, he was doing some heavy LSD and stuff. And, I don't think he was on acid at that point, but something had damaged his nervous system. He was not a well man. He was, but Jim Dixon, in his later years, developed some kind of illness where he had to go to the hospital, and we didn't know if he was going to make it. So I went to the hospital with my guitar to cheer him up and played some songs for him. And that's when he gave me what I think might have been a deathbed confession, although he didn't die then. But he said, well, Gene left the band, but Eddie Tickner and I, that was his co-manager, were thinking about spinning him off to be a new Elvis Presley.
So he was going to go solo.
Yeah.
Wow.
And he did.
Wow.
And he did. And he didn't become Elvis Presley, but yeah.
Interesting.
He did some good stuff. He did some really pretty,
Absolutely.
like no other. It's really a fine album.
Mm-hmm. When did Ticket to Ride come out in relation to Byrd's time?
It came out after the Byrds.
So guitar-wise, it must be inspired by, because it's so much of the Byrd sound.
Yeah, I think so. I know we did influence George because he sent Derek Taylor back from London with a tape of If I Needed Someone, and he got the riff from my Bells of Rumney. So, and he asked Derek to tell me that, and I was, wow, man, the Beatles inspired us, and we've inspired the Beatles back. It's really a cool thing.
It's the best. It's the best to make something you love, and to also to be recognized by someone that you respect their work. There's no better feeling. I
know. It's great. And we became friends. The Beatles and the Byrds became friends, and we hung out together and, took acid with them.
This is a weird thing I was thinking about right before we started talking. I looked at your discography and started thinking that we tend to think of musicians' lives through their discography. And I was feeling like it doesn't make sense. And I feel like it's not fair. I don't think the discography is a true reflection of you.
Doesn't do justice.
Yeah, I don't think so. I never thought about it before, but for some reason it hit me today that the discography, it's just another detail.
Well, it's just the gig. It's just what we do for a living. And then there's a life that goes on beyond that. But it's an exciting gig. I've enjoyed it. I've been very blessed that I could make money as a musician my whole life and never really had to do a day job except the Brill Building.
Yeah, which is not bad. And it's a good story.
That was a good experience. And then being a studio musician was a good experience.
Do you write songs all the time?
No, not anymore. There's no market for me doing that at this point. I don't really feel inspired to do that. I'm happy just doing the folk den, keeping the traditional stuff alive.
Great.
And it keeps my chops up and keeps my recording chops up and my playing chops up and vocal. And so it's really fulfilling. I'm working on a project. It's a slow going, labor of love kind of thing. But Jacques Levy and I collaborated on a musical back in 1968 called Trip, T-R-Y-P. Gene Tripp was an anagram of Peer Gynt, and he got the idea for the story from Ibsen's Peer Gynt, but he wanted to move it to the western United States. And 1968 is when the Byrd Sweetheart of the Rodeo came out, so he thought I'd be a good guy to co-write the music with him. And we wrote about 26 songs, and the thing never got mounted on Broadway. It did finally get played when Jacques became the theatrical instructor at Colgate College in Hamilton, New York, and the kids there did a version of it. But I'm re-recording some of the songs, and some of the songs were on the Byrds records, like Chestnut Mare. And I'm a little conflicted because I've re-recorded Chestnut Mare, but you're never going to get it to sound like the Clarence White version that came out on the Untitled album. And I was thinking, man, do I want to license this stuff from Sony or what do I want to do? But anyway, I've re-recorded it. It sounds pretty good. I got Marty Stewart to play the Clarence White parts on Chestnut Mare.
He's great.
And they're spot on. He got that part right. So I was going to do a narration between the songs, kind of like Peter and the Wolf.
Nice.
And some of the songs have never been recorded before. Like, so it's Peer Gynt went around. He had the Borg. It's like this supernatural force that kept him going from job to job. And so that's what happens in the Gene Tripp thing. He's a preacher, he's a riverboat gambler, and he becomes a stagecoach robber at one point, and a politician. And that's where the song "I Want to Grow Up to Be a Politician" came from.
That sounds great. I can't wait to hear the whole thing. I have one thought when you talk about doing covers of songs you've already been involved with. Think about it like you're doing a cover of a song that you had no part in, and you want to reinterpret it in your own voice, making believe that the other one was not you. Like what would be the new? Do you know what I'm saying? Instead of trying to remake,
it's a mental adjustment.
It's a mental adjustment of just think of like what
don't get intimidated by the original.
No, let go of the original completely and make the most interesting version to you today, forgetting what the old one was. Just look at the chords and the melody and rethink the approach. And
that's good advice.
Yeah, it's great because you can also, there's a chance you'll make one that's better than the original. You're never going to make one better than the original trying to do the original. But, it happens sometimes where a cover song transcends the original because you find a new way in, and it's really interesting.
Okay. Thank you.
My pleasure. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today. This is great.
Oh, you're welcome. I had fun. It was great.
Thanks again to the great Roger McGuinn. You can hear a playlist of our favorite Roger McGuinn and Byrd songs at brokenrecordpodcast.com. You can follow us on Twitter at Broken Record. Broken Record is produced with help from Leah Rose, Jason Gambrell, Ben Tolliday, and Eric Sandler. Our editor is Sophie Crane. Broken Record is a production of Pushkin Industries. And if you like the show, please remember to share, rate, and review us on your podcast app. Our theme music's by Kenny Beats. I'm Justin Richmond.